Please be seated. After I read that gospel, I think the ushers must have been a little worried that Jesus was going to come flying in here with his whip and his overturned tables and say, "Everybody out!" But I think St. Margaret's would not have made him so angry. Why was he angry? What was wrong with what they had done? Because in essence, they thought they were doing God's will in the temple. Many years before then, Moses was reading the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments were two parts of a tablet. The first five were on one side, and those five were about our relationship with God. They were about how we honor God in our everyday life. And then the second five were those of how we work as a community. Do not steal. Don't covet your neighbor's parking space. Things like that teach us how we use and work as a community. After Moses read them, he placed them in a box for safekeeping. Well, eventually, that box became very decorated. It had gold wings. It had this sort of bizarre locking system, way before we had locking systems. It was guarded by Levites who would protect it, and it was called the Ark of the Covenant. The Israelites believed that God was in that box. So when they went into battle, the special people would carry the ark ahead of them, the box, thinking that God was leading them into battle. And they would win. And it became such a holy place that in order even to go near it, you had to be of a special family and a special priestly family. Eventually, that Ark of the Covenant was carried to Jerusalem. And they put a very ornate tent over it. And it was said that during the night, the tent actually would glow. Around the tent, they had these legion of people surrounding it. Finally, Solomon built a temple around it. They put the ark, the box with the Ten Commandments, in the middle of the temple. And then they started to build out bigger and bigger and bigger pools and rooms, to the point where the people almost forgot that the ark was there. And in fact, after the Babylonians had invaded, they stole the Ark of the Covenant, and it was never seen again. But the priests and the Levites and everyone else had such a good gig going on that they didn't tell the people that the ark was no longer there. It was the temple that became the holy place. It was the temple where you went to talk to God. Many of you remember Richie Robertson, who was our sexton. The second day he was here at St. Margaret's, he locked the door of the church. He had no idea that he was the first and only person ever to lock that door. We have no key to that door. It took us about an hour to get it unlocked. And as far as we know, that is perhaps the only time that door has actually been locked. St. Margaret's is a place where people come day and night to pray, to find God here. It's amazing to watch the people ebb and flow through here because they believe that this is a special place where God resides. We don't keep God in a box. But we also don't keep God in the church. By the time that Jesus came to the temple, The synagogues actually were satellites of the temple. If you wanted to talk to God, if you really did, you had to go to the temple. But the temple had become a marketplace. It had become a community center. In order to make a sacrifice, you had to buy a cow or a sheep or a dove or a pigeon. And so, but you had to have a money changer in order to change your coinage, because the coinage had Caesar's face on it. And they could not bring that coin into the temple. So they had the Gentiles actually set up on a table to exchange Caesar's currency to the temple currency. Meanwhile, there are cattle and sheep and everything else roaming around the temple. Jesus walked in, and it was almost as if he sensed that they had forgotten God. That somehow or another the institution, the humanity that was there had kind of boxed God in, forgotten God was there, and became fully human, as a fully human institution can be. Because we are humans, and somehow or another we find it easier to deal with each other than we do to deal with God. And yet God is the first five of the covenant. And unless we remember that, and the first one being, we will worship God, then we become a very human institution. And we start kind of bickering with each other. You're in my pew. You're not singing the hymn right. Though that hymn was beautiful. You know, James wrote that hymn, the gospel procession hymn. That was anyway. I digress. We become very human beings. And so we kind of get miffed every once in a while and walk away. I'm mad at the church. I won't come to the church. But what about God? As a community, we strive so hard to remember that our central purpose here in this place, in St. Margaret's, is about God. We start every vestry meeting with prayer. We end every vestry meeting with prayer. We start every missions commission meeting with prayer. We end with prayer. We are people of prayer because we need to remind ourselves that God is in our lives. In our discipleship class that meets on Wednesday morning, we are struggling and trying very hard to remember that when we leave here, God is out there. So we're doing things like praying for each other with prayer partners. We're trying something called flash prayers or swoosh prayers, where you see somebody and pray for them. See somebody and pray for them. Just to remember that God is not only just here, but outside. How many of you know that above that door there is a sign that says the servant's entrance? It's to remind us that God is not only here in these pews and in these walls, is to remind us to take God with us. So that unlocked door is not only to welcome people in, but to allow us to go out into the world. At 9 o'clock, I talked about putting God in your pocket. And somebody came to me and said, well, I only have dirty Kleenex in my pocket. Well, take God with you. Remember that we are, first and foremost, people of God. As you are St. Margaret's, you are St. Margaret's in this building with no lock, but as you leave, you will be St. Margaret's of God as you take God with you. Pray for people. Worship God here and outside. Be of St. Margaret's and be of God. Amen.
Aye.